Does anybody have any questions for any of us up here, or Chelsea, or Charmaine, or John, or Michael? Yes.
I believe that most of the people in this room are here because they have some understanding about the foster care system and care about it. But this issue, at least from my experience, pales in comparison to matters of resources, not just money resources, but if you go to a legislature and you talk about kids, everyone nods their head knowingly, and then goes on to the next taxation issue, or mining, or water, or whatever the issue of the day is. How do we, as a group of people who obviously care about this population, change that trajectory? How do we keep this issue in the forefront of those who can change laws, those who can change policy, those who can train judges and social workers?
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you some brief experience. Hope, Michael, you'll tell yours. I mean, I came to Youth Villages 36 years ago, and we had horrible funding from the state and no champions at the state. Most state officials basically felt any money in child welfare was like putting money in a black hole. And it was just pouring money in. And as you well know, the child welfare systems across the country have a new leader every couple of years. There's lawsuits. There's, you read in the newspaper how children die in custody, or, there was some kind of investigation and they overlooked something and a child died. And so, it's, most governors just want to stay as far away from it and hope nothing bad happens. I don't think they really feel that way, but I think a lot of legislatures, and they don't really understand it. It's so very, very complicated, and the kids in foster care don't really have champions for them. Their parents aren't there advocating as much, because she mentioned her dad was in prison, her mom had other issues. So what we were able to do is we were just constantly meeting with, if we would find a little window of opportunity, we'd find a champion, whether it was a Michael Leach or somebody else in the department, and constantly just find different champions in the legislature. Or if somebody had a child or a relative that had a similar experience, we'd find them and build a relationship with them. We'd find people in our community that were, to be honest with you, donors and friends of high government officials, whether it was a legislative person or somebody in the governor's office. And those are the people that got the ear for them, for our kids on our behalf. It wasn't us that worked for the agency. We didn't have those kind of relationships. But we've constantly built relationships and advocacy organizations in all the communities work. But I will tell you, it has a lot to do with those people with tremendous resource that have those relationships already, and that really help. And really, I think when state officials sit down and they really listen and hear the story and have a chance to meet young people like Chelsea and hear stories about Fred or other kids that can succeed if they're given the reasonable resources, I think they're better in supporting our work. But I also think that they want to find organizations and services and programs that work. That doesn't mean we don't have problems. We all have problems. There's always going to be a kid or a staff problem, but they really want to support programs that they're putting their money in a worthwhile area, that there's going to be better outcomes, and there's evidence to prove what they're doing is work. And the organization or the service that they're providing is constantly trying to prove itself and get better. I think that's what we found. People listen more, but they also have to tell the personal stories. So Mike, you may want to share your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen a lot of success with states who just have youth heavily involved and beating down that door and knocking on, and calling their legislator all the time. And in Delaware, they're doing tremendous work, and it's because of the youth engagement. I mean, they got their governor on board, that he shows up all over the place talking about child welfare issues, and it is because the young people won't stop there. And so you have to help your young people, empower them that they can make a huge difference with this. But it is difficult because there's so many other things and other laws, other agendas, and it is hard to keep it on the radar. And when it is on the radar, it's because something bad has happened, and they want to come to us and say, what do you need to do to fix this? Why are you screwing up on this area? Understandably in some situations, but I want to say, if you are involved in supporting the whole time, this wouldn't have happened this one time, right? You need to help us make some of these differences. I can tell that story, but a young person can tell that more from their perspective. It's a great question, and it's hard to answer because I think it's a struggle from my perspective where I'm at in state government. But at the same time, I'm not going to give up on these young people, and I'm going to fight to the point where, I get my hand slapped a few times, but you just have to do that. And I want Chelsea or her peers also to take that approach. So we have to teach them that this is their life and they can make a difference for them. And a lot of them want to give back. So here's your opportunity to give back to other young people by doing those things. Yes.
Yes.
How successful are you in recruiting foster parents and keeping kids in the same family? Or do we have a lot of jumping around?
Well, I can speak to our state agency, and I'll let Charmaine speak to her experience there at Youth Villages, but roughly statewide, we have around 5,000 foster parents, including the ones that we partner with and contract with private providers. So of those 5,000, roughly 2,600, 2,700 are families that we would license by our agency. And we found the majority of our families end up leaving because they're providing permanency to either a relative or they're adopting from our agency. So they're leaving for the right reasons, but we're always in this constant struggle of continuing to recruit and the need for new foster parents all the time.
Well, like John said, it's a struggle. Just as far as recruiting, we put in a lot of money and time and effort to get the appropriate foster parents in, because we typically only have therapeutic youth, so they're therapeutic foster parents, so they take a different level of youth. But I think also, making sure that you have a model that's supporting the foster parents to keep them and not just recruiting to replace constantly. And then also having a system where we're moving kids out, like John said, to home quicker, so we have more opportunities for other kids if they need foster care. So trying to keep everybody moving, but there's a lot of supervision and oversight and trying to continually recruit new homes.
I will say one thing. Y'all, like 15 years ago, Tennessee had almost 13,000 kids in care. I mean, Tennessee we work in a lot of states and have done, what so many states say we need more foster homes. No, you need to identify the kids first that are in your care that probably could go home with services to be more with their families, or even kinship care like Chelsea, versus being in the business of trying to think the state's the best parent. We are not good parents. I mean, I'm saying we provide service for state kids. We need to help families. Sure, some kids can't go back to their families. That's focused toward adoption or kinship care, but states so often, we find, are always trying to get more foster homes instead of really looking at the kids they have in care and the families they can return to. And Tennessee has been the best state we've ever been associated with, really trying to keep kids with their families and return them back successfully as soon as possible. And when you have so many fewer kids in custody, you can devote more money and resources to those kids who really need services versus scattering it across 13 or 14,000 kids. And we work in state after state that are half the size of Tennessee that have as many kids in custody or more. And some of you are from those states. It's hard.
Thank you. Assemblyman Mike Sprinkle from Nevada. And I'm trying to figure out how I want to ask this question, so bear with me. But my wife is a social worker for CPS. She does permanency work. And so I kind of feel like I have a little bit of a unique understanding simply because I go home to this every night as a legislator. But one of the things that I consistently hear from her is how overwhelmed they are with their caseload. And working with the kids that are on her caseload, either through permanency, sometimes when we're looking at kids transitioning out at that age, those are the services that get left behind because they just don't have the manpower. They don't have the time. They certainly don't have the money or the resources. One of the things that we've seen in my community is this growing trend towards reaching out to community participants, kind of a public-private sort of relationship. And it's starting to work well, but it's still very limited when we're dealing with the kids that I think we're talking about here today. So with all that being said, I guess my question is, do you feel as a legislator it's going to be more beneficial for me to throw down some mandates to force a reallocation of resources on the counties or the state, depending on who provides these services, or if it continues to need to come from the bottom, from those agencies, working with me to see what's going to work best?
Great question. I'll try to try to attack it. child welfare systems are overwhelmed across the country, and case loads are high in many states, higher than they need to be. Tennessee, the settlement agreement that happened in 1999 that John was talking about, obviously we didn't want to be sued, but there were bad things going on, and it has led to a lot of great achievements within the state and better practices for young people, including caseload caps where you can't go over, and making sure there's additional support, psychologists, education specialists, nurse consultants, independent living people. So there's a lot of wraparound for that frontline staff person, so that they don't feel like they're all alone out on a limb with no support. So that's been helpful to us, and I think when hopefully we'll be out of this over the next year, we need to make sure that funding continues to make sure that not just because the lawsuit goes away, the legislature says, oh, they don't need money anymore. No, I mean, we have to keep that same amount of funding to make sure that we can keep our caseload caps down to what they need to be and provide that support. So that's kind of the first part to that. The second part is I think the harder thing. I do think that Tennessee, as we entered into a 4E waiver to make sure that a lot of our funding is going to prevention side. So we're going to try to have more funding going on to prevention with our 4E dollars. Hopefully making sure that young people and children and youth aren't coming into custody, which would help caseload caps as well, things like that. I do think that state agencies need to regularly look at their population of children and youth in custody and evaluate where the services are and the funding are and reallocate those monies from time to time. As far as the young people go aging out, I think it's as much a culture issue as a funding issue. So I have a lot of supports. You've seen all that stuff. You've heard all that stuff. I got to get the culture changed within the system to go, this young person aging out is as important, and the services are as important as the 4-year-old on your caseload, maybe, right? Because they're going, I got to make sure that 4-year-old's under, the Brian A. lawsuit. I got to make sure he's getting everything he needs. He has a long life ahead of him. This 18-year-old, he's out the door. I'm done with him in a month. So, so that's a part where we within the system have to make sure that we're changing the culture so that it's not like that. So I wouldn't say, we need to change allocation and funding to make sure that this population get what they need. You need to make sure they get what they need, but the system has to do its part to make sure that they're creating a priority for this population as well. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit. Maybe not. I'm trying.
Hello, I'm Representative Holly from North Carolina, and I have a question about going back to the families. The ultimate goal is to get the families, but when a child has had a lot of support in a foster care environment, and then they go back in a family who is struggling at best initially, is it a different system in Tennessee that takes care of that family? Will they be moved from like one department to another, losing social workers and the continuity that they've had in their lives? Or does that social worker who is with them in foster care then go and try to help that family keep that child?
Only for a short time period. When we reestablish permanency with a young person, we do provide additional services while they're in the family for a period of time. And that's through our performance-based contracting work. But at some period of time, we end services and that young person's back in the family, and hopefully, there's been enough work done to strengthen that family to where that young person's not coming back into custody. There are the community-based services that we can connect them to and refer them to, but it isn't an ongoing time frame that we're serving those young people.
Is there any research about when the families are reunited? Are there states where it seems like the families are reunited, now they've functioned fine for a month or 2 months, and then the child protection worker is out of the family? Are there states where now everything's working well, let's keep them together, and work with that family for the next 2 years or the next 3 years. So I don't know of any research. I don't know if, I'm from Minnesota, and I know that once the family is reunited and that's the goal and everything is going well, then they're discharged from child protection. But I've always thought that perhaps that's happening way too soon, and I don't know what the statistics are of when there's been one child protection case, then what, what the recidivism is the only word I can think of.
Yeah, I mean, those are, states should be looking at their, the maltreatment. So kids coming back into care within a certain amount of time frame. Within Tennessee, it's within a year. So obviously that's a negative impact on the provider and DCS if that young person's coming back within a certain amount of time. But yeah, also child maltreatment, things like that. I don't know if any states are doing sort of longer term services on the back end and if that's effective or not, outside of some of the basic stuff Pat might be able to answer some stuff.
We have an intensive in-home program that all of our kids that leave our residential and foster care programs that we have across the state, and the number is probably 1,800 a year, they get our intensive in-home services as well. And, most kids need 5 to 7 months of intensive in-home work. And that's someone visiting 3 days a week to help with that transition. And, we have all kind of data that can show, the shorter length of time, if families want to, drop out of the program, it's much higher success rate when we have that transition period for 4 to 8 months. And if the longer a kid's in custody, the longer it takes to help successfully transition that young person home with their families. So in other words, if a young person in custody 5 or 6 months, you might just need that service at home for 3 or 4 months. If a young person's been in custody 7 or 8 years, it's usually 7, 8, 9 months, maybe even a year, because they don't even know the kids anymore, really. So yeah, it makes a huge difference. I mean, really, if you don't have that, our own research shows, in our own programs years ago, the kids are pretty likely to come back into care, about half of them.
I guess on behalf of my co-chairs here and the hard work of Kelly Arnold, I can thank you all for being here. My comment at the preface to my question was somewhat of a setup. You all being here is like preaching to the choir. You're here because you care. So one of the things that I would ask you to do is to be sure that you leave this meeting, this session, and find someone in, whether you are on the executive side, the legislative side, the judicial side, wherever you find yourself attached to that particular title, find someone who wasn't here, who can help you change policy, who can help you be the advocate or the champion that we so much and so desperately need, and bring them along. Tell them what you've learned here today. If you have never sat in a courtroom where dependency hearings are being undertaken on a daily basis, go and do it, because you want to talk about the work that your wife does, Mr. Springle, the work that I get to look at every day. The fact of the matter is the workers can only do so much. This is interbranch. Talk to your judicial officers. You all can make great laws, and you can hire great workers, and you can find great programs, but your judicial officers need to be making sure that they're moving cases in a timely manner, so that kids don't languish in care any longer than they have to. That they're making strong and solid decisions with respect to the providers. So I guess my ask on behalf of this committee will be that you take some of this home, take it to the streets like we used to do back in the 60s, talk about it until there is change, make sure that there is reform, because I'd like to see 100,000 Chelseas coming out of our system if we could. So thank you for your time and your attention today.